got the level so high, I will have to introduce the Haifa University Egyptologist, Dr. Kahn. He will talk about the prophetic vision of Isaiah, first Isaiah 139. Dr. Kahn.
Well, good morning to everybody. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me. Indeed, it is a high standard I have to try to get to. So the first thing would be an apology for, I thought that there would be a PowerPoint presentation so I could show some pictures and the text. So everybody who knows it by heart, that is okay, and if not, then there will be a problem.
We will add those to the we can add those to the video at a later time.
Well,
if you like.
You may do that.
I will do that.
There's no problem. Okay. And the second thing is that how would I say it? I know the story. I don't know the exact details, but in an Orthodox school or so, they were planning to hire a teacher for Isaiah. Or for a Bible, and then they asked the teacher who came for an interview, how many Isaiahs do you think there are? So this teacher was thinking it over and said, well, one. It was an Orthodox place. And so the teacher was very happy. Oh, it's second Isaiah. That's the one. I will have a completely different view of things. I'm dealing with Isaiah 1, 239, the first Isaiah. And when I look at it, and there was talk about editing, especially editing at a later period, and when we look at the dates of what people suggest about this editing of first Isaiah, well, it varies a lot. From the time of Isaiah until the Hellenistic times. And I want to propose from a historical point of view that what we have actually is a Fortschreibung, so that there is continuous writing and editing of prophecies during the first temple period. And if I look at the criteria, it is difficult for me to find texts which you can certainly date to later than the first temple period. Certainly. And what people do is just date them and that's it. So I'm wondering if I will read it, but I will read it. I will see how it works. So, I will try to talk about the time of Isaiah's prophetic activity, and the superscription of Isaiah 1 states that Isaiah, the son of Amos, prophesied concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Yotam, Achaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Contrary to the superscriptions, scholars generally do not identify prophecies in the book of Isaiah dating from the reign of Uzziah. So we only have his mentioning, but not certainly dated prophecies from his time. The earliest dated prophecy in Isaiah 6 mentions that Isaiah had his probably dedication vision in the temple in the year that King Uzziah died. The last datable events, which are recorded in 1st Isaiah, are the events of 701, during Sennacherib's campaign against Judah. Thus, Isaiah's career covers some 35 years. Well, most of you know this period, or these periods, but we can say that he was speaking during, or prophesying during the Syro-Ephraimite War of 7, depends exactly what date it is, but it would be about 735 BCE. So chapters 6 to 9 are regarded as original core of Isaiah's prophecy. His personal Denkschrift, or memoirs, whereas the collection can no more be regarded as a united composition composed by Isaiah. Much of its core seems to describe the dramatic period in which Isaiah started his career. Chapters 6 to 9 describe the events of the Syro-Ephraimite War and siege of Jerusalem, which occurred about 735 BC or slightly earlier, since it is stated in 2 Kings 17:37 that Rezin, king of Damascus, and Pekah, king of Israel, already waged war against Jerusalem during the reign of Yotam, Ahaz's father. The exact date of the events described in Isaiah 7 and in 2 Kings 16:5 is debated. And the description of the Syro-Ephraimite War mentions in these chapters includes Isaiah's own viewpoint and a narrative describing the prophet's deed in third person, and this you probably already know. This prophecy is then, re-edited in already a few years later in the Assyrian, probably in the Assyrian intervention of Tiglath-Pileser III, or a bit later. Both descriptions of the event in chapter 7 and chapter 8, which I talked about before, contain clear editing, changing the attitude from issuing favorable al-tira war oracles, so don't fear, towards Ahaz, and it turns into a rebuke against him. It seems that the change in the prophet's attitude towards Ahaz is due to his political choice to rely upon Assyria, as is stated in 2 Kings 16:7. This information is not mentioned, that Ahaz sent his messengers to Tiglath-Pileser and subdues to him is not mentioned in Isaiah 7, but is reflected in the addition to the prophecy in Isaiah 7, verse 17, mentioning the king of Assyria. So in the beginning, Isaiah 7:17, the Lord will bring on you and on your people and on your ancestral house such days as you have not come since the days Ephraim departed from Judah. So it would be a wonderful time, wonderful period, seemingly exceeding prosperity. And then there are 3 words added. The king of Assyria. So the period which will come will be the period when the king of Assyria comes, completely reversing the meaning of the original prophecy from a prophecy of salvation or of prosperity to a prophecy of doom. Following the arrival of the Assyrian king, the times will become the worst since the schism. In another case, the prophet reworked the famous Emmanuel prophecy of salvation in chapter 8, verse 5. Emmanuel, that God is with us, into a prophecy of doom, threatening that Assyria will almost drown Judah as flooding river. So in verse 5, the Lord spoke to me again, because his people has refused the waters of Shiloh, and I wish I would know who this people is, that flow gently and melt in fear before Rezin and son of Remaliah. Therefore the Lord is bringing up against it the mighty flood waters of the river, the king of Assyria. So now we again have the king of Assyria going and flooding the whole territory and almost drowning Judah. Chapter 17 and 28 as well prophesies against Damascus and Israel and must be dated to the year prior to the fall, to the years prior to the fall of Damascus by the Assyrians in 732 and the fall of Samaria somewhere in 723. Thus, their time frame can be determined between 735, describing the events and political climate during the Syro-Ephraimite War, and the reigns of Tiglath-Pileser and possibly Shalmaneser, king of Assyria. So we have here a period of time which deals with Damascus and Israel and just before the fall of Israel. Then if we go to prophecies dealing with Egypt, I go to the prophecy against Egypt in Isaiah 19, 1-15, where brother strife and civil war between the petty kingdoms are described. That is in 19, verse 2. Ultimately resulting in Egypt being conquered by a harsh ruler, that is 19, verse 4. People try to identify this ruler as Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, Pi'anchi from the king of Cush, Shabaka, the king of Cush, Nebuchadnezzar, who didn't conquer Egypt, Cambyses, Xerxes, Artaxerxes II or Antiochus III. So whoever you want to pick as this harsh ruler, just make your pick. Without entering the many nuances of Egyptian history, it is possible to say that the notion of civil war and fragmentation would fit the period of the Libyan anarchy, which lasted until approximately the end of the 8th century BCE, preceding the conquest of Egypt by the Kushite king Pi'anchi. And to some extent, the conflicts were resumed and continued until the unification of Egypt by Psammetichus I in 656 at the latest. Thus, they will rule out the identification of the Babylonian and Persian kings with the harsh ruler and fearsome king Adonim Kasheu Melech Az as one of these. Furthermore, the mentioning of the political centers of Mof, Memphis, and Tanis, Tzoan, which lost their political significance, reflect a period prior to the Egypt's conquest by Pi'anchi, king of Cush, and the unification of Egypt under Kushite rule, and in somewhere 734 BCE, according to my chronology. So what I'm doing here is putting my agenda into Isaiah, because I wrote my PhD on Pi'anchi, so it must be Pi'anchi, the first ruler. This is also true of Isaiah 30, the early date. O rebellious children, says the Lord, who carry out plans but not mine, who make an alliance but against my will, adding sin to sin and going to Egypt, and we will not read the whole thing. For though, and this is in verse 4, for though the officials are at Zoan and his envoys reach Hanes is Heracleopolis Magna in Middle Egypt. So the messengers of the king of Egypt cannot go further than Heracleopolis. From the text itself, it is not clear whether the rebellious children are the people of Israel or Judah. Hoshea, king of Israel, in 2 Kings 17, verse 4, is known to have turned to the king of Egypt for alliance. It is not known whether Judah did the same during the second half of the 8th century BCE. So if we're asking ourselves if Chizkiah was an ally, or the Egyptian king was an ally of Chizkiah before the rebellion, and how much they worked together, there's no proof that Chizkiah and Egypt were working together. The date of this prophecy is debated, and most scholars assign it to the events of 701 BCE because of this relationship between Egypt and Judah. However, the political reality does not fit that period, but some decades earlier. This, and here you should have the slide showing the political situation in a period of time. This political situation, in which Pharaoh controls the delta and the Nile Valley only up to Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt and has no control over Upper Egypt, fits the reign of Shoshenq V, who probably was followed on the throne by his son or by his successor Osarkon IV, somewhere in 734 BCE. So again, we see early dating for this prophecy. We can now move on to the next period, the reign of Sargon II, that is between 722 and 705. Isaiah chapter 10, verses 5 to 15 or 19, depends how you see verses 16 to 19, which incorporates a prophecy against Assyria, has undergone editing as well. It seems that the list of subjugated kingdoms, which is there Kalno and Arpad and Samaria and Damascus and so on, describes Sargon's suppression of the rebellion in the Levant in 720, which is instigated by Yahubidi, the ruler, the king of Hamat, And it mentions also Carchemish in 7, and which was conquered in 717. The prophet then turns from proclaiming God's punishment against Samaria to Jerusalem. That is verses 11, 12, if I am correct. Possibly referring to the events of 701 BC, because it is now dealing also with Jerusalem. Finally, punishing God's rod of anger, Assyria. So we are going to a further step in the editing of the text. This change of subject in the prophecy seems to reflect 3 different historical periods, which can be very close. But first it is Samaria, then he deals with Judah, then the punishment will come to Assyria. The reassuring prophecy in Isaiah 10, 24 to 25 is directed to Judah concerning the defeat of Assyria. Therefore, thus says the Lord God of hosts, O my people who live in Zion, so Judah, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they beat you with a rod and lift up their staff against you, Bederech Mitzrayim, which is usually translated as the Egyptians did, beat you up. But it should most probably be understood as on the way to Egypt. This prophecy may reflect either Sargon II's victorious campaign against the Egyptians at the height of Assyria's power in 720, when he defeated Re the Tartan of Egypt at Ophiach. And now just imagine the text and the relief from Sargon's palace that he defeats the Egyptians. If this identification is correct, Isaiah's prophecy against Assyria did not materialize. It seems to me that it reflects a different period, as I will claim later on. The following text is Isaiah 14, 28 to 32. It is directed against Philistia and is dated by a superscription to the year in which the death of Ahaz, king of Judah, occurred. Bishnat Mot Achaz. It is not clear in which year Ahaz died and Chizkiah ascended the throne. According to 2 Kings 18:1, Chizkiah became king in the 3rd year of Hoshea, which many scholars date to 727 BCE, still when Israel was in existence. However, according to 2 Kings 18:13, Sennacherib invaded Judah in Chizkiah's 14th year. So his first regnal year must have been 715, because 701 plus 14 becomes 715. So it's not clear in the same chapter whether Chizkiah came to the throne in 727 when Samaria was still existent, or 715. So we have 2 dates. The prophecy in Isaiah 40:28 may reflect the Assyrian intervention in Philistia in order to quell Ashdod's rebellion if I take the later date, so 715, in order to quell Ashdod's rebellion, as is told in his royal inscriptions of Sargon II. The superscription of chapter 20 dates Isaiah's prophecies against Philistia to the year in which Sargon sent his Turtano against Ashdod. So, Bishnat Bo Tartan Ashdoda. In the year that the commander-in-chief who was sent by King Sargon of Assyria came to Ashdod and fought against it and took it. This event can probably be dated to 712, 711 BCE. Whether the rest of the prophecy is authentic and relates to the events of this year is debated by scholars. So we have here 735 to 723, then the years of Sargon 722, now we are already at 711, and you can see a continuous prophesying probably of Isaiah or somebody else, and they put it together under Isaiah's name. Finally, the dirge song against Hillel ben Shachar in chapter 14, whose identity eludes us, should be, I think, would be identified with Sargon. Hillel ben Shachar would be identified with Sargon, who was killed in battle in 705 and was not buried. There is, of course, an argument who this Hillel ben Shachar is, and there are, of course, many people who can be listed as Hillel ben Shachar. But I think like many others, that it is Sargon II. So the book of Isaiah also described the political and military events during the reigns of Sennacherib, who ruled Assyria between 704 and 681. Isaiah 22 described the preparation to the siege of Jerusalem, either the Babylonian siege, some people dated to that period, or more probably the Assyrian siege of Sennacherib in 701, following his personal prophecy to Shebna, the steward, Asher al Habayit, close to the events of 701 BC, but before. The highlight of first Isaiah is the description of Sennacherib's campaign against Judah in 701. For millennia, the story of Chizkiah's miraculous deliverance by the angel of God from Sennacherib, who hastily returned to Assyria, eventually being murdered by his sons while worshipping his God, has been perceived as the fulfillment of God's words of salvation to Jerusalem as a reward for the pious king of the house of David. However, according to the Assyrian sources, which were translated in 1851, Chizkiah did not win the war against Assyria. A similar description occurred in the opening verses of 2 Kings 18:13 to 16, when Chizkiah subdued to Sennacherib. And in Isaiah 1:4-9, and probably Isaiah 5:1-7, where you have the how do you say Kerem, the vineyard prophecy or song, comparing the vineyard to Jerusalem following the Assyrian campaign. Thus, an explanation was sought for the lack of correspondence between the different described outcomes of the event. On the one side, Jerusalem or Judah lost the battle. On the other side, they won the battle, or God won the battle for them because of the piety of the king of the house of David towards God. Several of the major problems in this text, so that is Isaiah 36-37, have been noted since early times. That is the existence of a parallel version in the Book of Kings, in Kings 18 and 19, and the difference between these versions. There are two consecutive accounts with almost similar development of the narrative creating repetition. So when Stade came with the idea that you have source B1 and B2, these are said to be two accounts of the same event put together or interwoven together. There are many breaks in the narrative, which were detected for the most part by scholars from the source critical approach, and scholars from the literary approach almost did not detect breaks in the narrative because it is supposed to be a coherent, flowing narrative, so you can't find breaks in it. And there are contradictions as well. So it is clear that Isaiah 36-37 is a problematic text made of more than one story or one source. So the scholars suggested solutions. In the second half of the 19th century, Stade suggested that Chizkiah-Isaiah narrative, so 36-37, is a composite literary creation. He detected literary literary themes, and suggested the combination of three sources. So source A, which is in Kings 18:13-16, or 14-16, and then source B1 and B2. According to Stade, Stade's hypothesis was further refined in 1967 by Childs. And now the question is, these two sources, B1 and B2, how historical are they? And then you can imagine here the slide saying that people claim that it is either very historical or completely non-historical fictional. So you have the various degrees of that. The degree of historicity of the accounts B1 was suggested, and the dates of composition vary from close to the events, so 701 BCE, with updates, because in 701 Sennacherib was still alive, so you had to kill him, so you have to update the story. The people dated to the 7th century during Yoshia's redaction, or even the early exilic period. So again, you have your divergent date or dates for the same text. And the historicity of the sources varies from reliable to an unhistorical, theological, fictional narrative. So what can we do with a text like this, and how can we learn history out of it? The Restades division of the text is commonly accepted by the majority of scholars. Some suggest a different reconstruction of the sources in order to solve them, to solve the detected problems in the narrative. And some find 6 or more strands, an addition spanning over a period of hundreds of years. And some say that it is a coherent narrative, and when you ask them when was the narrative written, some say it was written in the time of Menashe, and some say that it was written in the post-exilic period. So you have here a span of 500 years. So as I said before, the narratives include breaks, contradictions, inconsistencies, and what I want to add here is that there are threefold repetitions, not twofold like Stade found, but threefold repetitions, and I will mention several of them. You have 3 different Assyrian delegations, different emissaries, 3 different messages conveyed by the Assyrians to the Judeans, by different means, possibly 3 different locations where it happened. There are traces of 3 different responses of Chizkiah to the Assyrian threat, excluding Chizkiah's submission in Kings. Finally, Chizkiah received 3 different prophecies concerning the fate of the Assyrian king. So what I want to say here is that we don't have 2 sources in Isaiah 36, 37, but 3, or I would say 2 sources and 1 redactional strand. Can we detect the original sources and suggest a time for their composition? I think that we can. I will not go into that because that is a book I have just submitted, and that will take about 400 pages to explain that. What I can say is that I see here 3 periods of time in which, this text describes 3 different periods of time, and I will try going through my chronological order of things, also refer to those 3 periods. The first period is the events of the late 8th century BCE. That is the invasion of Sennacherib's army in Judah. That is obvious. The Assyrians sent emissaries headed by Rav Shakeh to the walls of Jerusalem, hurling threatening words at the defenders of the wall. And I will not go into the whole thing of the text. I just want to point out that the text in Isaiah 36-37 contains an earlier layer, not only Sennacherib, but even an earlier date, dating to the reign of Sargon II. The list of conquered kingdoms in Isaiah 36, verse 19, reflects the conquest of Sargon II, maybe Tiglath-Pileser III, but most probably Sargon II, especially between 720 and 717 BCE, and not the military achievement of Sennacherib, because he did not conquer all those places, he just got it ready from his father. So Isaiah 36, 18 and 19 has any of the gods of the nations ever delivered its land out of the hands of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamat and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? That is not Sennacherib, because Sennacherib did not do anything like that. These kingdoms were subjugated in the days of Sargon, reflecting the same period as Isaiah's prophecies in Isaiah 10, verse 9. Naaman already saw that and attributed them to Sargon, and the author of Isaiah 36-37 attributed them to Sennacherib. So he took an already ready prophecy and he attributed it to Sennacherib. Another verse that was recently reinterpreted and redated to the reign of Sennacherib is the mentioning of the rivers of Matzor in 2 Kings 19:23 or Isaiah 37:24. They were identified normally by scholars as the Nile of Egypt, since they were identified as the Nile of Egypt, which were dried by the king of Assyria, they were wrongly dated. The first Assyrian king to conquer Egypt and reach the Nile was Esarhaddon, so it was dated to his time. However, lately, Elnatan Weisser from the Hebrew University showed that this whole verse is totally understood in a wrong way, and it deals not with the conquering and drying out of Egypt, but with, how would I say, irrigation projects of Sennacherib. So we have here a wrongly dated by scholars verse, so we can date it to the days of Sennacherib. Until this point in the lecture, I've told you what everybody already knows and what is obvious. In the book of Isaiah, we can find texts that were written during Isaiah's term of office, and some of them may be original to the prophet Isaiah. But I think, when I come from an historical perspective, that we can date, or that there were updates and more prophecies written later on. And what I claim is that these were not updated in the Persian period like most scholars say, but much earlier in the 7th century. So clearly there was an updating of the story of Sennacherib's campaign in the days of Menashe. Since in 2 Kings or Isaiah 37:9, Taharka is mentioned as king of Cush. Now many people wrote about Taharka mentioned as king of Cush. I think the reason that he is mentioned as king of Cush is because he was king of Cush. And that was in a very specific time period between 690 and 664. So it was not written before that. And I would say that after that it was probably not written because you must understand, Taharka is portrayed as the possible savior of Jerusalem. Now in 2008, there was coming out a film that was planned to be made a film by Will Smith. Do you know Will Smith? Mm-hmm. Which is called The Last Pharaoh. I don't know who The Last Pharaoh is, but the one Will Smith was planning to make a film about is Taharka. He was not the last pharaoh, but it's a good name for a film. And he, the black guy, was supposed to save the world from the bad Assyrians. So, for some reason, this film did not come out. But it deals with the events. He wanted them to deal with the events of 701 BCE, but Taharka was not king back then. He was king in 690 to 664. What I have to say is that the end of Taharka was not very good because he was expelled from Egypt by Assyria. Now, writing much later in time about Taharka the savior, who actually did not save anybody but lost the war, would be, I don't know if you remember the elections in 1996 here in Israel, when Peres lost the elections, then he stood on the podium and asked everybody, "I'm a loser?" And everybody shouted back, "Yes, you are a loser." Yes, because he lost, and everybody knows that he lost. Okay? Now everybody knows that Taharka lost. It is very difficult to imagine a period in time where you try to sell Taharka as the savior when you know that he lost. So I would put this prophecy in a time when he still was a savior. That is one point. The second point is that Sennacherib's murder is described in detailed, very detailed described. Yeah? We know exactly how he died, even better than the Babylonian Chronicle. And we can verify most of the details there. So that is again in 681. The third thing or point is that I would want to say that the smiting of the Assyrian army by an angel of the Lord, which is the climax of the Chizkiah-Sennacherib narrative, yeah? And describes the divine victory of God over the Assyrians, did not happen in 701. And if I look very closely to all the periods when the Assyrians lost in battle, there is only one serious defeat. And that is in 673 BCE, when the Assyrians tried to conquer Egypt and lost in battle. So again, this is in the time of Taharka, when Taharka won. The Assyrians were defeated, really defeated, because going to cross Egypt, the Sinai into Egypt, and then lose battle there, imagine, go to 1967 or 1956 when the Egyptians lost in battle in the Sinai, and then you have postcards, Israeli postcards, wishing a good year with high shoes or high boots that the Assyrians, that the Egyptians left on the battlefield to run faster. So imagine this when the Assyrians lose battle in Egypt and have to run all the way, 250 kilometers, all the way to the other side of the Sinai. You have it also in Herodotus, this story about the defeat of the Assyrians in Egypt. Additional echoes to the Assyrian defeat on the way to Egypt can be found in the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 31, and I will skip a bit, verse 8, "Then the Assyrian shall fall by the sword, not of mortals, and the sword, not of humans, shall devour him. He shall flee from the sword, and his young men shall put to forced labor." Another chapter in the book of Isaiah dealing with the anticipated defeat of Assyria, and most probably describing the same event, is in Isaiah 10, which I already hinted to you, that the Assyrians will, do not be afraid of the Assyrians when they beat you with a rod and lift up their staff against you on the road to Egypt, so Bederech Mitzrayim. For in a very little while my indignation will come to an end, and my anger will be directed to their destruction. Now imagine they already lost a battle in Egypt, and now Isaiah is prophesying that the end is very soon, which is very logical. I would not date it to the days of Sargon II, but to the days of Esarhaddon. When assigning the prophecy in Isaiah 10, 24 to 27 to the defeat of Assyria in 673, the prophecy could be understood as a Vaticinium ex eventum, reflecting the defeat of Assyria on the road to Egypt and the ensuing hope of throwing off its yoke. These are not the only verses in the book of Isaiah whose composition could be assigned to the 7th century BC. If we go to Isaiah 19, 16 to 25, this is the addition to the prophecy about Egypt, and it is clearly an addition, a later addition. It is regarded as later editions. The oracles are composed of 5 pericopes written in prose and beginning with the words "on that day." It is not agreed upon among scholars whether Isaiah 19:16 to 25 is a coherent text and composed on one occasion, or result of a gradual growth. So is it written in one time or every time again? The dating of this text varied considerably and spans about 550 years. So the continuity of the prophetic genius of Isaiah would, well, I think this is a good, but I'm going to spoil this party. Some consider that it was written by the prophet himself or his close disciples. Others have dated these verses to the late Hellenistic period, the period of the Maccabees, or the time of high priest Onias IV. So somewhere after 160 BC, we can throw this idea out of the window. The text was dated by Kaiser to the Ptolemaic Seleucid Wars at the end of the 3rd or early 2nd centuries BC. Others dated to the Hellenistic period, the beginning of the Hellenistic period, to the dates of Alexander the Great, the Persian period, and some say, why deal with history? Let it be eschatological without any historical value at all. A minority of scholars date these verses to the 7th century. Actually, there are two which I know who dated to the 7th century. To the days of Yoshia or the reign of Menashe. Basically, I adhere to a continuous foreshadowing of consecutive oracles during the 7th century BCE. For the sake of brevity, I will summarize the reconstructed events and say that the oracles deal mainly with international relations between Egypt and Assyria. They were not written as a coherent text composed on one occasion, but are the result of a continuous updating of prophecies. So if you want continuity of prophetic genius of Isaiah, it is continuous, but not over a span of hundreds of years. It's in the 7th century. The verses 16 to 17 about the dread of Egypt in Judah, I would say that that has to do with the outcome of the Battle of El Tekel 701. Verse 18, which is later, I would date to 671 when the Egyptians are conquered by the Assyrians and their the people who help them, the mercenaries and Assyrian soldiers. So if there is a Mizbeach and Matzeva built in Egypt, it is not by the Egyptians, but by people who conquer Egypt. Verses 90 to 21 to 22, I would date to the period when Egypt was under Assyrian rule. The interesting thing about this is that it has, it uses words from the Exodus narrative. And this would mean for me that the author knew the Exodus narrative in the days of Menashe, in Judah, so in the first half of the 7th century BCE. If we look at early mentionings of the Exodus, there are not so many. These are one of the earliest ones, as I see it. And I'm sure that people will disagree with me. Okay. The later verses, or verse 23, when there is a Mesilah built between Egypt and Assyria, and the Assyrians, the Egyptians of Dim, how would you say, I would translate it, are subdued to the Assyrians, not work or worship together with the Assyrians, which is a common translation. I would say again that this is showing the period when Egypt was under Assyrian rule, 7th century, very specific period of time. It can thus be concluded that the editor of chapter 19 added and updated constantly prophecies against Egypt during the entire 7th century. The rest of the 7th century I will talk about a bit later. Another prophecy of Isaiah can be added to this discussion. Isaiah 11, not the prophecy about the Messianic king, which is a very good question when it should be dated. I would say either it is Chizkiah or Yoshia, or it is a eschatological one. That's a very easy thing to say that it is the future Messiah, but I don't know. I cannot say about that. But the historical setting on verses 11 to 16 is a matter of debate as well. The prophecy is part of a collection of 4 prophecies, 11 to 16, introduced by the formula Vehaya bayom hahu, exactly as in 19. And it should come to pass in that day. These oracles announce the future relief of Assyrian oppression. Okay. The prophecy in Isaiah 11 to 16, Isaiah 11 verses 11 to 16, which announces the future restoration of Israel, when the remnant of the people will return from exile. When I was a student some 25 years ago, I took a course at the Hebrew University about the book of First Isaiah. My professor, Israel Fall, noted that, and I quote him, "This chapter is late, הפרק הזה מאוחר," not specifying how late it is. Many scholars have tried to date this pericope through a wide variety of dating methods, historical, linguistic, intertextual criticism, etc. The different analyses of the text have led to a variety of views and did not achieve any conclusive and accepted dating, and the dating ranges from, guess, 734 BCE, so the first prophecy of Isaiah, to 170 BCE, the time when the Dead Sea Scrolls say you can't go any further in dating it to the Byzantine period. Returning to my professor's remark that it is late, I analyzed the historical and geographical information which occurs in the verses, and I will just read, I didn't put it here because it's supposed to be on there. That the remnant will return from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Patros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, which is Babylonia, and from Hamat, and from the islands of the sea. Now, taking this information, keeping in mind the possibility that parts of the oracle were composed at different times, and edited at the later stage, because people say that Assyria and Egypt come together, and all the rest is a later addition. I take that into my mind. What I found out is, and this is my summary, which you can't see on the PowerPoint presentation. I surveyed a historical reality in which Judeans or Israelites could be exiles in these places and could return from them, because the hope is that they should return from these places and that they are still there. Yeah? So I checked the possibility, when it is possible. And I was quite surprised, because I thought that I would find a date for second Isaiah, so about the early Persian period, or if I'm very lucky, I could find a historical reality in the time of third Isaiah, and then I could date third Isaiah, if there is one, to a period which fits this prophecy, if it is one of those Isaiahs. I was very surprised that the possibility to find exiles going to these places, being in these places, coming back, or the possibility that they come back from these places, is in the mid-7th century. And even could be narrowed down to Ashurbanipal's reign, about 655 and 645. This is only on historical grounds, and I don't get any dividends for dating this prophecy to the 7th century. I don't care if it is second Isaiah, so 540 BC, 550 BC, in the time of Cyrus, Persian period, third is, I don't care. This is what I got. So verse 13 points to considerable improvement in the relations of Judah with Ephraim. The policy of reconciliation is reflected during Manasseh as well as during Josiah's reign, and cannot be detected during the early Persian period, when Israel and Judah, or what was Israel, does not exist, but the relations were not as good. Verse 14 deals with the wish that the joint forces of Judah and Israel will subdue and control the Philistine and Transjordanian kingdoms. This wish for the future was not relevant after the demise of these kingdoms during the Babylonian Empire. So these verses are not relevant. The river. What is written there? In verse 15, which imagine is here, what you have is that there is a hope that the remnant will come back and cross the river, which is smitten into 7 branches, or 7 Nechalim, smaller rivers. Now, at 9 o'clock in the morning one day, my mother calls me hysterically at home, and she says, open the television, open the television. I said, what's the matter? And she said, well, there's a lesson about, a biblical lesson by Yair Zakovich and Avigdor Shenan in the Knesset. Listen. And normally I say, well, I have other things to do. I have to work, I have to prepare my lessons. But this time I opened, and they were talking about the, Abraham going to Egypt in the Bible. That was Zakovich. And Shenan in the pseudo, the Genesis Apocryphon. And there it was written, or there he mentioned in the text, that Abraham, when he crossed the Nile, he crossed the 7 branches of the Nile. 7 branches. I said, oh my God, I'm so blind, I'm so stupid. Of course, the Nile, which I know as an Egyptologist, and you know, I know my geography a bit, the Nile has 7 branches. The Euphrates does not have 7 branches, right? So we're talking about the river, which everybody says the river is only the Euphrates. The river is the river Nile. And the prophecy says that he hopes that the people will return, the remnant of Assyria, or from Assyria, will return from Egypt and cross on dry land those 7 branches. Now, it is not returning from Assyria and from Egypt, or only from Assyria, as people understand. No, it is the returning of the people of Judah who were in Egypt under Assyrian rule, and the Assyrian rule collapsed, the hope that they will return safely home without being slaughtered on the way on foreign territory. Now imagine, the empire collapses, the people are stuck there, say in Elephantine or somewhere else, and now their family wants them to come back and hope that they will not be slaughtered. This makes perfect sense, especially if the river is not the Euphrates or the Nile, but the Nile. Now, if you take all this prophecy together of Isaiah 11 to 16, you have a perfect date. First of all, you know when, I guess that I know when the Assyrians had to retreat from Egypt. And second of all, that there were Judeans in Egypt during that time. And that the hope was that they will return safely home. So again, I can date it to the mid-7th century. When I think that the Assyrians retreated when they had to put all their effort in putting down the rebellion of the brother of the Assyrian king in Babylonia. So that is between 652 and 648. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
How much?
10 minutes.
Okay, so I will not finish this. I will say that it goes on that we have in the end of the Assyrian Empire in the Levant is also mentioned in several chapters. the first, now we have to ask ourselves, when did the Egyptians, when the Assyrians retreated from the Levant, when and how did the Egyptians come in? Some people say that they came in by agreement. Yes, the Assyrians retreated. The Egyptians, when they saw that the Assyrians are weak, made an agreement with them and got in instead of them. Now, I don't believe in agreements under retreat. When you smell the fear or the weakness of another party, you just beat them up. You don't make an agreement with them, a gentleman agreement. So what I understand is that the Egyptians, when the Assyrians were weak, the Egyptians just kicked them out. So I wrote it, I started to write about it and submitted it to Tel Aviv. They didn't like it because in Tel Aviv there is Nadav Ne'eman who says that there was a agreement during the retreat of the Assyrians. So it was not accepted. In the meantime, there is an Ostracon redated, an Ostracon in Egypt redated, telling that Psamatichos I, in 637 BC, because there is a date, was on the border planning to go into the Levant. Yes? So there is a friction between the Egyptians and the Assyrians, which is not reflected in the research, but is now can be documented. And you can find it in Isaiah. You can find verses about that in Isaiah. Like Isaiah 18:19. Isaiah 7:18-19, where on that day the Lord will whistle for the fly that is at the sources of the streams of Egypt, and for the bee that is in the land of Assyria. And they will all come and settle in the steep ravines and in the clefts of the rocks, in the land of, in the Levant, wherever. So they are both there. And Isaiah 14:24, I think also can be dated to the end of the 7th century. It describes the defeat of the Assyrians in the mountain areas of the land of Israel. So again, the Assyrians are defeated. If you want to see any historical reality behind it, which is accomplished, then it should be the 7th century. It doesn't have to be. And you have also in Isaiah 14, verses 24 to 27. I want to return to Isaiah chapter 19, the last verses 24 to 25. On that day, Israel be a third with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, whom the Lord of hosts has blessed, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my heritage. There's much to say about these verses, but I won't. It is possible to date the addition of the last prophecy in verses 24 to 25 to the last quarter of the 7th century BCE. It is clear that after the struggle between Assyria and Egyptian Saite dynasty over the Levant, which I talked about just now, at some point Egypt established control and eventually cooperated with the remnant of the Assyrian dynasty, this we all know, to ward off the Babylonian threat. During this period, cooperation between Egypt and Assyria is recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle. Judah was subjugated to Egypt and was part of the coalition which stood up against the rising Babylonian Empire. The last point, the Babylonian period. The humiliation and demise of the Assyrian Empire to the Babylonians is probably recorded as well, depending on the interpretation of Isaiah 7:20, so the next verse which I mentioned before about the war between the Egyptians and the Assyrians in the land here. On that day, that is Isaiah 7:20, on that day the Lord will shave with the hired razor Be'evrei Nahar, on probably the two sides of the river. And then there's written the king of Assyria. So is the hired razor the king of Assyria? Will he raise? or is he going to be shaved, or his beard is going to be shaved? He will shave the head and the hair of the feet and will take off the beard as well. So it depends how you read this text. It may be the end of the Assyrian Empire. An update during the Babylonian period of the story of Sennacherib and Chizkiah. I told you that we will return to that. Nadav Ne'eman already said that the mentioning of the ruined towns in Isaiah 37 verses 12 to 13 reflect the result of the military activity of the Babylonian kings, Nabopolassar, and he says also Nebuchadnezzar. But the date of these places which are conquered is between 600, I would say 23 or 616 and 609 BC, and not furthermore, or not later. So what we are talking about is the conquests of Nabopolassar being mentioned as Rav Shaker says to the people in Jerusalem, look at those places. Did they withstand my might, that you can stay here in siege? You will be also conquered. He is demanding Chizkiah's capitulation. Nabopolassar, actually, and not Rav Shaker, boasts of having destroyed all these kingdoms without serious resistance. This seems to be true. The kingdoms mentioned in the list indeed fell very rapidly to the Babylonians, including Nineveh, Ashur, and Haran. Haran is mentioned. Ratzapu, Gozan, and Bit Adini, which are also mentioned in these verses. And Hamat, which is conquered in 605 by the forces of the king Nabopolassar just before he died. Now, this is said, as I understand it, and as Amitai Baruchi Una understands it, and as Clemens understands it, in the Babylonian period during the siege of Jerusalem. So Clemens was dealing with Isaiah 39, where the Babylonian delegation comes, and after Chizkiah showed everything to the Babylonian delegation, Isaiah says to Chizkiah, because you showed it to them, they will go into exile. Or all these things, all these treasures that you showed will be taken, and your children will be owners in Babylonia. Clement says that this is during the Yoachin's exile in 597. I agree with him. Another case is Baruchi Una's convincing article, where he shows that the Sennacherib campaign against Judah in Isaiah 36-37 is probably written during the siege of Jerusalem, the last siege of Jerusalem, somewhere between 588 and 586. This is a very new article. I want to add to Baruchi Una's points, and I have almost nothing, I'm almost finished. So I want to add to Baruchi Una's words that when Jerusalem despises the king, that is in Isaiah 37, verse 22. She despises you, she scorns you, virgin daughter Zion. She tosses her head behind your back, daughter Jerusalem. Baza lecha, la'aga lecha bat Zion, lecha betulat bat Zion. Acharecha rosh enia bat Yerushalayim. While the Assyrian king boasts of having destroyed all the kingdoms with serious resistance, Jerusalem still withstood a prolonged siege. This clearly distinguishes Judah and its capital Jerusalem from all the aforementioned kingdoms in Isaiah 37, 12 to 13, and proved the boasts of the Assyrian king or the Babylonian king to be just that, empty boasts. So we have here already the period and a continuous verses or prophecies during the entire 7th century. I will just add that you have one more period, additions in chapter 13 and 14, you have a prophecy against the fall, or about the fall of Babylon, which should be dated before the fall of Babylon, because it is not like the actual fall of Babylon. And the Medes from Media are the opponents which were anticipated to put down Babylon, or conquer Babylon. This cannot be written after the Medes were conquered by Cyrus in 550 BCE. The prophecies in Isaiah 21, which are not clear to who they are said, Masa Midbar Yam, to the wilderness of the sea, probably deals again with the fall of Babylon and the Medes putting them down. The following prophecy against Duma or Edom, I don't care if it's Duma or Edom, Duma is in Saudi Arabia, Tema, is it Tema? No, I'm not sure that it is Tema, I think it is. And against Ba'arav, mentioning the Kedarites, can reflect any of the Assyrian kings, but if we look at the area of these verses, having before Babylon, it is possible to date it to the reign of Nabunaid, the last king of Babylon, and these areas are attested during his attested stay at Tema in Arabia. So what we have here, I would say, is, if we look from the beginning of the lecture to now, from 734, the beginning of Isaiah's prophecies, a continuous prophetic work, or not only prophetic work, until the days of Nabunaid, during the reign of Cyrus, but before second Isaiah. And basically, I cannot date any of these prophecies to second Isaiah, or his editing, or whatever. So I would say that first Isaiah is not first, but first A, B, C, D, E, F, but during the days of the first temple period, and they don't have anything which I find from the second temple period. How all these prophecies came together is a very good question. Do you have here a school of Isaiah, or something else, or a family who collected all these things? I don't know. Maybe you have answers, but the school and the lecture stops here. Thank you.